Now, you've adapted several of your movies from different sources, one of which is Jumanji, which was adapted from the book. How did you come on that project, and where did you start with that?
Jumanji was something that was in development for many years at Sony. It was for
many years before the movie was released?
Correct. For those who are not initiated to Chris Van Allsburg's work, he does these extraordinarily rendered, magical picture plate books for smaller children. Jumanji was a book of, I think, 12 or 15 picture plates that told a very simple story, and that was children are left alone during a particular day. They go out into the forest and they find a board game. They bring it back to the house, they open the game, they roll the dice, and big, large animals come out of the game and maraud around the house. And they have to finish the game, and so that all the animals are returned to the game, they stow it back in the woods before their parents come home. And that whole story takes place in about 12, 15 picture plates. The problem for Sony in their development was how to take that rather linear story and to turn it into a 3-act feature film structure. And they had commissioned a whole bunch of screenplays that had been unable to do that in a satisfying way. And so Joe Johnston, who I'd known, who actually directed one of my episodes from Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, and I'd known Joe for some time. I'd very much admired Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. I thought it was brilliant, particularly for the budget. Mm-hmm. He called me and he said, he asked me to come aboard the project. And so I was still living in New York, and I flew out here, and I flew out to California, and Joe and I started meeting. And I didn't know how to turn the picture plate book into a 3-act structure. And Joe and I walked around the Sony lot. I mean, all the way around, Culver, Washington Street, Madison, all the way around. I think we did 3 full laps around the entire lot. I don't know how many miles that is, and during the course of that, we came up with the movie basically as it is, and that's how it all happened. But the whole notion of one character being sucked into the game, which is the Robin Williams character, and then coming out of the game, having it multi-generational, that had been suggested by some other people, but it hadn't really. It was buried in a preceding screenplay. Oh, and now in a situation like this, when you're brought on to something with history, do you read the other screenplays or just kind of go from the source material yourself? Or is it kind of depends on the situation? It depends on the situation, but I digested everything, and so that's how it all evolved. I mean, it was something that I don't generally do stuff like that. I do kind of a little bit more adult or harder core kind of stuff, but I really liked the project, and I thought the take was good, and I had a great deal of faith in Joe Johnston's ability to execute it directorially. And Joe's a bit of a writer himself. He's a bit of an innovator, story innovator himself. He's good at it. We continue to develop stuff, Joe and I. And I worked a little bit on Jurassic Park 3 that he did. Not much of my stuff made it to the screen. I don't think anything did, right. But I was involved early on. But now, when you take something from another medium, like your adaptation of The Saint, how much attention do you pay to previous incarnations of something, or was it a challenge to take a character that was, maybe beloved by buffs, but like wasn't really well known by of what you would call a mainstream audience, and how did you approach that task to make it? Yeah, on The Saint, I think we were quite free because we didn't have constraints because there wasn't a well-known awareness film. It had been that Roger Moore series in England that just did not have pervasive notoriety, and we were pretty free to do what we wanted. The original author of the Saint novels, Leslie Charteris, had passed away, so he wasn't in the background, lobbing stones at us. What interested you in the character? I don't quite know. I truly don't. It seemed to me when I read the original Leslie Charteris novellas that it was kind of a James Bond character the way Ian Fleming wrote it. Right. See, the Saint was not this debonair guy the way Charteris wrote it. The Saint was a rogue, and he was a rough and tumble dude. And that's what my original script was all about.
Okay.
It was about that character. That's not the movie Paramount ended up making with Val Kilmer, so.
Right. Was your approach to that script, because it was based on something pre-existing, did your approach differ from your approach on original material, or it's the same process for you, kind of that same outlining, writing process?
Yeah, it's the same deal. You know, only you're helped a great deal more when you're adopting, because you have all this good stuff that you can pick and choose from. You know, very, very rarely does a screenwriter come on to a book project and say, yeah, I love it, I want to adopt it, and the first thing I want to do is throw it all out and start from scratch. I mean, you're mainly gravitating toward an adaptation because there's so much of the underlying material that you want to preserve, generally.
Now, did you work on the Hulk?
The Hulk is, yeah, I worked on the Hulk.
Speaking of things adapted from other mediums.
Yeah, the Hulk is a tough one to describe because it was a tough part of my career. That was a Joe Johnston project. Joe had been brought on. They asked me to write it, and Mark Platt, who was the head of production then of Universal at the time. Mark was the head of production at TriStar and Sony when we did Jumanji. So when Mark moved over to Universal, he wanted to get the Hulk going, and he wanted to get it going with the Jumanji team, Joe Johnston and I. So Joe came on to direct the movie, and I came on to write it with sort of a loose attachment. The deal was for Joe and I to sort of bandy about ideas and come up with a plot line, and then if we liked it a lot, we'd go for it. And we'd sign pay and play deals, et cetera, et cetera. So Joe left to do something else. I can't remember what it was, but he left off on another project. And right in the middle of me executing the screenplay.
Would that have been October Sky around that time?
It was before then.
Before that?
I can't remember. But Casey Silver then, who was then the president of production, I can't remember what the hierarchy was at the time. He had read what I was doing with the Hulk and very much liked it and asked me if I wanted to direct it. And so I came on as the director, and we went into pre-production. Casey then was fired, and the whole regime at Universal was tossed out, and a new regime came in, and they did not look favorably upon the old regime's projects, and it stalled. And, you know, I had another one of these executive shift nightmares.
Right. It's kind of hard to deal with because it's so out of your control. It's, you know, 1 minute you're writing for one set of notes, and the next minute the whole regime's gone, and you know it seems like it happens more and more lately. But
it is happening more and more, and I don't think it's not good for Hollywood, and there's nothing to be said. It's just a regrettable part of my career, and it's, you know, hopefully it won't happen again. But
now, counter to that, kind of your collaborations with Jerry Bruckheimer probably represented a continuity for you in your career, because you wrote several originals for him, and you also probably script doctored on some of his projects. And ultimately, that's probably a good relationship for a writer to have, because you found kind of a simpatico with one of those powerhouse producers you were describing with Clout.
Yeah, that whole period was excellent. You know, part of my time here in this business, we got a bunch of films made, and they made a great deal of money. It was very lucrative for me. It was.
What were the peak moments, kind of like? What were the?
Oh, I think going out to Alcatraz every day on the Rock. I think the first time that I saw the set design of the asteroid surface for Armageddon. I think hanging out in the window of a desert with Nick Cage. You know, there's a lot of really good memories on Con Air. You know, fucking around with John Cusack and Malkovich and all those Buscemi and all those lunatics. You know. Yeah,
that was a great ensemble.
Yeah, yeah, those were good years, and I moved on now. I'm doing other things. I'm directing now, and I'm focusing on smaller, more character-driven action pictures. Totally character-driven. I want to try that and see what happens. But
is there an example of a character-driven action film or a character-driven classic film that that comes to mind as one of your personal favorites, or one that's a good example of what you're describing?
There's so many, and it's so hard to do. You know, I think, for instance, the way Shane Black probably originally conceived the Lethal Weapon characters, in his wildest imagination, I don't think that he would have thought that it would turn into the juggernaut that it became. I think that, you know, people sometimes forget that the opening sequence in Lethal Weapon, you have the hero of the piece sticking the barrel of a gun in his mouth, going to blow his head off because he's so distraught over the tragic death of his wife.
It's a long way from that to Joe Pesci.
Well, exactly, exactly right. And so often I hear studio executives or producers say, well, Jonathan, give us Lethal Weapon. And I say, do you want Lethal Weapon 3 or do you want Lethal Weapon? Because the gulf between the two is vast. The first is truly character-driven. You have one cop who wants to kill himself, paired with another cop who is retiring in a week and will do anything to preserve his life until his retirement date. It's, you know, it's obvious, but it's about as character-driven as you can get, and it's...
That's a good example. How does your relationship with someone like Jerry work? Is he just in the room with you, or does he kind of like, is he very detail-oriented in terms of dictating, like on those scripts that you kind of like doctor on, but also the originals, you know, did you work very closely with him?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, I didn't really doctor anything for Jerry in the way most script doctors work. I didn't come into polished dialogue, or I mostly came in, well, there were so many different functions for me on all of them, but the universal thing that I provided was more of an overall structural kind of hammering down, kind of providing a basic architecture of first act, second act, third act, and an escalation of events, and a funneling of the action toward an explosive conclusion, and things like that. General architecture, and then, well, for instance, The Rock, I mean, you know, the transition of every single scene, all the dialogue, but for very little. I did all of it. And Con Air, I did a great deal of dialogue writing as well, but mostly scene transition, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, et cetera, structure, all the way through.
And I know it's tough to say, but are there pros and cons in terms of being in league with a powerful producer like Jerry, or is it really just about the job, no matter who you're working for?
The pros are you're not pissing in the wind. You're not fiddling around with your time. Your time is going to result in a feature film being made and released in 2,500 to 3,500 screens with big fanfare and large stars and all of that, and a great deal of excellent production value, etc. The cons probably are that there are going to be other writers involved. There are going to be other creative points of view. You have to check your ego at the door. You know, there are no prima donnas. You know, I think that Jerry does believe in a kind of a collective approach to it. He likes to hear from a number of creative sources, particularly writers. He likes certain writers to do certain things. He always liked me to establish the architecture and do a lot of the dialogue. But he liked a lot of other dialogue writers to come in. He used Aaron Sorkin a lot. He used Ian LaFrennay and Dick Clement. He used Quentin Tarantino from time to time, got a couple of pictures. J.J. Abrams, a number of people. So,
and is that process, is it any worse or any better than any other process, or is it just one of many processes?
It's just one of many processes. If I had written, you know, my life story, if my dying grandfather had told me some astonishing story from 1910 or whatever, and it was true to my heart, and it was truly my baby, and then I had gone with someone like Bruckheimer, and then all these other writers were involved, that would be disconcerting, to say the least. It would be troublesome. It would involve ego issues, but not for these other vehicles. No.
Got it. Now, have you been through the arbitration process with the WGA?
Unfortunately, to my great consternation, yes.
How does that process work? Like, what's the mechanics of it, just in terms of process?
Well, I'm biased about this. I've been really at war with the WGA. It forms the greatest disappointment of my career. The fact that I was not given screen credit in the Rock, for The Rock, which I still haven't gotten over and never will.
How does it, for people that don't know, like how does it literally work? Like what makes up the arbitration body?
There is an anonymous panel of 3 arbitrators that decide the screen credit. All of the material written on the motion picture is submitted to those 3 anonymous arbitrators, and they determine the screen credit. There is no appeal. There is nothing a complainant can. There's no recourse for a complainant. There's nothing you can do.
So their word is final.
Correct. And I could go into, in an extremely boring conversation, all the ins and outs of United States labor law, why this trade organization, the WGA, is allowed to have an independent arbitration of its credits, but it would take too fucking long. And
gotcha. I get the drift, though. Moving on to your directing, with The Punisher, did your process towards writing change once you became a director? Like, did you alter your process as a writer at all?
Yeah, I didn't think it was. You know, I arrogantly thought that I was, in previous movies, that I was writing as a visualist, as a director. But I found that that wasn't really true. And as soon as I did have the director's job on The Punisher and know that I was going to be visualizing everything that I was writing, I did have a bit of a schizophrenia there. And I'm over it now. But that first go-round was odd.
Right. And
different.
Because you had to write to a budget? Or
yeah, right. Well, I always was writing to a budget. But no, it was more like I'd write a scene, and then I'd reread it the next day, and I'd say, what's this going to look like?
So you'd write at night and reread as the director the next day and see,
and
what's this guy giving me?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, this fucking idiot writer has left me the scene, and now I have to alter it to make it visually more interesting, and so I'd have to fire the writer. And
right. Now I've worked with Avi Arad and the kind of Marvel universe. Was that in terms of being able to like liberate that character from the comic book pages, was that in the way at all, or did you guys agree right off the bat what kind of movie you wanted to make?
He asked me. No, the hardest thing with The Punisher was I had a bunch of money that was pulled from my budget at the very, very end of the pre-production, so that the final week of pre-production, leading up to the first day of principal photography, I had to work about 20 to 22 hours a day. I know this is playing the smallest fiddle, etc., to try to reconfigure the script to meet the new budgetary parameter.
That's always hard in the 11th hour.
Well, especially, I wanted to be energetic and come into the first day of principal photography raring to go, and it was just very, very strenuous. I didn't want my directorial debut to go that way.
Right.
But secondly were my own inability to control the tone of the picture. Avi Arad sent me the book by Garth Ennis, the graphic novel Welcome Back, Frank, where the Punisher comic book character went in a vastly different direction. Garth Ennis is an Irishman, and he injected all this bizarre humor into it, really wacky stuff. And I loved it. But it was a really, really hard tone to cinematize. And frankly, I think that I could do a much better job with it now. I'm very pleased with a lot of it, but I think I would have controlled the tone better if it had been my second or third picture. But we'll see. It was a great film to start on.
Right. This may be a loaded question, but if you could change the system in some way, anyway, like what would you change, or what would be the first thing you'd call for in terms of change?
I would re-empower the producer.
That's good to hear.
It's not meant to...
Right, no, I understand.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, I don't know how you would have felt when you were head of production at New Line. I don't know if
But I was a special kind of executive.
Yes, you were. Yes, you were. I mean, it's interesting. And I'll put it not in my voice. I'll put it in George Lucas's voice.
Fair enough.
Okay? And I know that George won't mind me saying this. I saw George at a party a year ago, and after the traditional, hey, how you been, etc., we started talking about Hollywood and what we each hate about current Hollywood, you know, hierarchy, etc. And George related the following. He said that he had been called by a head of one of these multinational corporations who wanted to reorganize the film division of this multinational corporation. And he was seeking George's advice how to do that. And George said, well, 20 years ago, when I went onto the lot, I would deal with all of the executives, marketing, production, post-production, everything in one building. Now when I go onto the lot, only creative is there. Where before, in other words, the people who developed the scripts, et cetera, who had choices, creative choices about the plots of the movies, what the actors were wearing, you know, what the backdrops of the scenes looked like, super creative choices. Where before those were in the hands of 4 executives, they're now in the hands of 30 executives. Each executive having to justify daily their paycheck, okay? And he said, fire them all. This was the advice that he gave to this guy. Fire all those executives and re-empower the independent producer. Strike deals with those producers in town whose tastes you admire or share, whatever, bring them on, and have them do all that work. Have them develop the scripts. Have them out in Hollywood developing relationships with actors, directors, writers, etc. Suffice it to say, the guy did not take George Lucas's advice. But.
Right. So do you think the studios having a direct line to directors and the producers being kind of shoved to the side has contributed to the kind of, you know, watering down of the whole process? Or do you think there's a studio-director relationship now, including the 15 executives and the director, that kind of obfuscates the producer?
Yes.
And I guess with someone like Jerry, you get the opposite of that experience.
Absolutely. I mean, look at my own experience. You know, one can argue about the quality, what have you, or from a taste perspective about the pictures I made with Bruckheimer, right? But one can't argue with their economic success, their ability to travel around the world, to do business in all the foreign markets, their continued success on DVD, etc. I mean, they are not the pinnacle of taste.
Right.
But they're well-crafted pictures, action pictures. And I think they're a little bit a cut above a lot of the dog shit that is currently coming out of the studios.
For sure. Well, we want to thank Jonathan Hensleigh for being with us today. Thank you as well for watching. Please be sure to check out the other great interviews in this series with industry pros. And remember, it all starts with you. The next written by credit could be yours. I'm Mike DeLuca.